nice introduction, thank you. I think this is my 6th time back to Oregon in the last 2 years. It's great to be back here, thank you. It does feel very friendly here. Been on the road, I think, about 150, 200 days in the past 2 years. Not always at such friendly events, so it's what Marcia asked me to do was sort of look at what has happened in the last 2 years after I wrote the book, and maybe what we can see what's happening in terms of changes, and also maybe what we can learn from what's happened in the past 2 years. And I told her at dinner tonight, didn't really prepare a talk, so this is going to be a little bit like jazz. We're just going to bring it just a bit. So just, some of you read the book, some of you did not, and the book really sets up an essential tension for society, an essential question for society. And I really think it's a profound moral question. So it goes like this. It's around how do we as a society really respond to mental distress, psychiatric distress. Are we doing it well? Are we doing it humanely? Is it working for us as a society? Is it working for individuals? Or not? And if not, what might we do differently? And what science may tell us about doing differently? And I think you can see, one of the things a society does that is so important and is so revealing about a society is how does it care for those in distress? It really is a measure of that society, so I think you can see what a profound question this is. And it's also a question, you know, that really is affecting childhood in this country. That's because more and more children are getting diagnosed and medicated, so we really want to know if that's working out well as well. So these are profound moral questions. Now, the conventional belief, which we started with, is that we are doing a great job. And the conventional belief goes like this. In 1955, we get a drug called Thorazine into asylum medicine, and this launches a psycho-pharmacological revolution, this great leap forward in care of mentally ill. It enables us to empty the mental hospitals, and then if you hear the words, we get antipsychotics. You hear that word? Antipsychotics, like antibiotics. In other words, that they're antidotes to psychosis. Then we get antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents. All of these tell of drugs that are antidotes to specific diseases. And if that's true, that is generally a story of great medical progress, when you have antidotes to a specific, well-defined illness. And then as part of this, again, this story of progress, it goes like this. In 1987, we get Prozac that arrives on the market. This is an SSRI antidepressant, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And this is the first of what we call the second-generation psychiatric drugs are better than the first ones. So the first-generation antidepressants were tricyclic antidepressants and monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Now with the Prozac's arrival, we get the SSRIs, and they are said to be safer and more effective than those older drugs. Then we get new antipsychotics. We get new atypical antipsychotics like Risperdal, Zyprexa, Seroquel, Abilify, and they are said to be so much safer and more effective than those old drugs like Thorazine and Haldol. So it's a story of medical progress. And as part of this arrival of the second-generation drugs, we are told that they fix chemical imbalances in the brain. Okay? Again, that's a story of great progress. Because generally in medicine, when you see great leaps forward, you come to understand the biology of a disorder, and then you have a drug or a treatment that really fixes that pathology, okay? And that's what we as a society were told. They fix chemical imbalances. And by the way, recently there was a survey, and 80% of Americans now know that depression is caused by low serotonin, and the drugs fix that. Okay? That's our belief system. And in 1998, our U.S. Surgeon General, our top doctor in the country, wrote a 400-page report on mental health. And he said this: prior to the arrival of Thorazine, we lacked treatments that would prevent people from becoming chronically ill. And now we have a vast array of safe and effective treatments for well-defined mental disorders. So officially, at the very top level of our medical establishment, we have this story of progress. Okay? Drugs that prevent criticism. Now, what do I do in Anatomy of an Epidemic that sort of challenges that wisdom, that conventional belief? Well, the first thing I do is I just look at disability rates and how they've changed since 1955. And this is the number of people under government care due to mental illness, and how has that changed as the psycho-pharmacological revolution unfolded. Now, the reason this is a beginning metric for sort of assessing whether we've had this great leap forward is this. Generally, when you get treatment, a medical treatment for a problem, a disease, a disorder that is effective and a great leap forward, you will see the burden of that disease either at least stabilize in a society or hopefully decline. Does that make sense? When you get an effective treatment. So I just wanted to look at how many people do we have on disability under government care, and how did it change as this psycho-pharmacological revolution unfolded. Well, if you do this as a first metric, you find that in 1955, at the start of this revolution, there were 560,000 people in state and county mental hospitals, and at that time, people who, quote, were disabled by mental illness, that's where they were. There was no social security to take care of people in the community. But you dig into that number a bit, you find about 200,000 people in those hospitals who were there with neurological disorders, end-stage Alzheimer's, syphilis, other things, and there were 360,000 people with psychiatric disorders, okay? So the disability rate in 1955, at the start of this revolution, was about 1 in 480. So you take that number, you look at the total population, and that's how you calculate the disability rate. Now, what other researchers have said, researchers studying, quote, the number of disabled mentally ill in our society, have said is, what you have to do to track this number going forward, because we do deinstitutionalize, and you have to start looking at the number of people on SSI or SSDI. These are government programs for people who are disabled by some disorder or another, and look at people on those programs due to mental illness. Okay? That's what other researchers say the best metric going forward. You do that, and you find in 1987, which by time deinstitutionalization is pretty complete, there were 1.25 million adults 18 to 66 on SSI or SSDI in 1987. So during this era of the first generation psychiatric drugs, we went from 360,000 people to 1.25 million. And that's a disability rate of around 1 in 184. So you see a rise. Now the caveat with that is this. Maybe you had to be much sicker to be in the hospital in 1955, to be on disability in 1987. So maybe that's an apples to oranges comparison. But we have the same metric going forward from 1987 forward. And it's during this period, 1987 forward, that we really embraced this drug model of care, the use of psychiatric drugs. So for example, in 1987, we spent $800 million in psychiatric drugs in this country. In 2007, we spent $40 billion. So that's a 50-fold increase. And now what happened to disability numbers during that 20 years? Well, it went from 1.25 million people to 4 million people. It tripled. Now, I wrote this book in 2007. The book was published in, what year is today? 2010. But the book was published in 2010, so I was really tracking the numbers in 2007. Anyway, I think we're up to around 4.8 million now. So there's been another 800,000 since I really did the research for this book. And so we're now getting down to a disability rate of around 1 in 60. Okay, so you see that as this psycho-pharmacological revolution has unfolded, rather than the burden of mental distress sort of declining in our society, it has grown by leaps and bounds. One other thing here. How about children? In 1987, there were 16,200 children on disability under age 18 due to mental illness. In other words, they got an SSI payment. Today, we're over 700,000. And it's during this time, of course, we've done a lot of diagnosing and a lot of use of medications. If you follow those kids, it's almost as if, and if you follow those kids forward until age 18, about 2/3 now go on to adult disability when they hit age 18. And so you sort of see opening up in our society this new pathway for some kids. They get diagnosed, they get medicated, they get on disability, and many of them have a life as a mental patient, so to speak, laid out before them. So we're seeing distress among our children increasing. Now this does not prove anything about the merits of the medications, but I think it does this. It begins to raise a question for us as a society, right? Is this really working, this paradigm of care? Because I think two things. Ideally, we don't want people to go on disability. I mean, it's great to have disability out there as a safety net, but ideally we're going to help people get back to work full lives, right? I mean, that's the goal. And also, just as a society, we just can't continue to afford these rising disability numbers, so you can see we might have to do something different as a society. Okay? So that's one thing. So then, what I did want to do, once I got those disability numbers, is look at this question. A couple of questions related to the medications. Well, the first thing I wanted to look at, do they fix chemical imbalances in the brain? Is that story true? The second thing I wanted to look at is, how do they shape long-term outcomes? Now, what happens in our society, the way we assess the efficacy of drugs, why they get approved by the FDA is they knock down the target symptom of a disorder better than placebo over the short term, okay, for 6 weeks. I was asking a different question. How do they affect lives over the long term? And in many different ways. The symptoms, employment rates, socialization rates. This is a very different question. And one of the things that I think has happened since the book was published, and one of the reasons, sort of jumping ahead, so I've been on the road, it seems endlessly. I've been asked to travel to many countries. I started giving grand rounds at medical schools. And I think the reason is, it's really the first book to look at that question, and to look at what science is telling us about how medications shape long-term outcomes. Now, another question I raised was this. If you look at what's driving the disability numbers, it is affective disorders, it's not psychotic disorders. It's people with diagnosis of depression and bipolar illness, and in particular, bipolar illness. Now, if we go back 40 years ago, the prevalence of manic, what was then called manic depressive illness, it was a rare disorder. It's about 1 in 5,000 adults would have a bout of manic depressive illness in any 1 year. Anybody know what the prevalence of bipolar disorder is now among our adult population?
1 in 100.
You say 1 in 100, any other guesses?
45.
What's that?
1 in 20.
Well, actually, there are some ways of defining bipolar that say 1 in 20. But more generally, you'll hear 1 in 50. So we went from 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 50. So one of the things we want to look at is, where are we all the bipolar patients coming from? All right, we really need to figure that one out. So what do I write about in the book? I'm not going to go through the research, but if you look into the chemical imbalance story, it goes like this real quickly. That whole story arose from understanding how the drugs act on the brain, and not from investigations into people so diagnosed. So, for example, let's just say the low serotonin theory of depression, which we've all heard about. Here's how it arises, in a real quick sort of biological lesson. How do neurons communicate in the brain? We have presynaptic neurons that release a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger, in this case serotonin, into the tiny gap between neurons, which we call the synaptic cleft. And then that messenger, that serotonin, binds with receptors on the receiving neuron, which we call the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, and that's how a message is passed. And then in order to make that message crisp, the serotonin, that chemical messenger, has to be removed from that gap real quickly. And it's removed from that gap in one of two ways. Either an enzyme comes along and metabolizes the serotonin, and the metabolites are carted off as waste, or the serotonin is taken back into the presynaptic neuron via reuptake channels. Now listen to SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. The drug blocks those channels for serotonin to go back up into the presynaptic neuron. Okay? So therefore, serotonin stays longer in the synaptic cleft. It is said to increase serotonergic levels, okay? Because the drug has that effect, people hypothesized that depression was due to low serotonin. And what they then looked at, to try to investigate, once they had this hypothesis, they looked in depressed patients, and they looked to see if those presynaptic neurons put out less serotonin than normal. And they just didn't find it to be so. And then they looked to see, well, maybe the problem is those postsynaptic neurons have too few serotonergic receptors, and that's the abnormality in depressed patients. They didn't find it to be so. And you can read, therefore, away from the, we all read if we watch TV, we've all seen the commercial, you have like the happy face, there's the unhappy face, and then you get the serotonin and you have a happy face, and I think then what happens is you walk along the beach with a beautiful woman and life is good, because your serotonin is now in balance. But actually they just never found that low serotonin was the problem of depression. And just one small thing you can read in a book called Essential Psycho-Pharmacology by Stephen Stahl. He's a famous molecular psychopharmacologist. He writes in 2000, there is no real serotonergic deficit. Okay, just didn't find it. Okay, so that was one finding, is that, and you could do this for others, did we find that the pathology of mental disorders was due to chemical imbalances? We just didn't find it. Now, this does not necessarily mean there's no biology involved, there's not some biology to be found. It just means we didn't find that as the characteristic pathology. And by the way, you can also read a 2005 paper by Kenneth Kender, co-editor-in-chief of Psychological Medicine. He sums up this long search for chemical imbalances and he says, we have hunted for big, simple neurochemical explanations for mental disorders, and we have not found them. Okay? So that's the first thing I looked at. We have a paradigm of care governed by a belief that the drugs are antidotes to chemical imbalances. But I have to say, what science is telling us, and you're going to be surprised by a quote I'm going to read in a little bit, it's a societal delusion. Okay? Now, it's really hard to have artful use of a medication if it's based on a medical delusion. And then you can see the medical delusion says this is like insulin for diabetes, that's why you have to take the drug for life. But that's just not what science is telling us. Okay? So that's, I think, one of the first findings in the book. Now the second finding then, and this is key to try to understand how medications may shape long-term outcomes, is once you go on the drug, what happens to your brain? Okay, how does the drug modify your brain? And here's what science shows. So let's say you go on an SSRI. The SSRI blocks the normal reuptake of serotonin from that synaptic cleft, right? It's acting as an accelerator on serotonergic activity. Now your brain, being this extraordinary neuroplastic organ with all sorts of feedback sensors, very quickly says, uh-oh, there's too much serotonin in my synaptic clefts, and I need to compensate for that. And it compensates by putting down the brake on serotonergic transmission. The presynaptic neurons put out less serotonin than normal, at least for a period of time. And the postsynaptic neurons, the one receiving the message, actually decrease the density of the receptors for serotonin. Okay, so if you go on an SSRI, after a while, you have about 50% fewer receptors for serotonin than normal. Now, you can see, I think, a bit of an irony here. It's, prior to going on the medication, there was no known pathology. Okay? We don't know what may be going on. We hypothesized that the problem was low serotonin physiology. Once you go on the drug, in essence, that's what you have. You have a low, physiologically speaking, you've sort of been driven into a subserotonergic state. And we're going to see, again, some comments that have come out that since the book was published that refer to this modification. Okay? So that's the story of chemical imbalances, and it's very different when you dig into the scientific literature. Now the final question is, or the next question is, how do they affect long-term outcomes in the aggregate? This is a very complicated story in terms of how you fit this together, and I'll tell you it goes like this in big picture how you do it. The first thing as a journalist is you want to figure out what is the evidence base for the use of these medications, right? I want to see, so let's say I'm a psychiatrist at a medical school and I'm giving this talk, I will say, we have really solid evidence for the use of these drugs, both short-term and long-term. And let's just look at the antipsychotics, because the evidence base for all psychiatric drugs begins with the antipsychotics. They're at the heart of the psycho-pharmacological revolution. And the evidence base consists of two parts. One, again, you take people coming into an emergency room, this goes to the 1960s, patients. Let's say they have psychotic symptoms. One half is randomized to drug in the hospital, the other half is randomized to placebo in the hospital, and then we look 6 weeks later. Which group has a greater abatement of their psychotic symptoms? And with some great regularity, it's those treated with drug that have a greater abatement of their psychotic symptoms. And because of that, the drugs are seen as effective. Okay? They knock down the target symptom better than placebo. Now, once that information was in hand, this goes back to the 60s, and doctors were treating their patients with these drugs, and let's stick with the antipsychotics. They had this question: how long should patients be on these drugs? Right? Makes sense. You would think. And they ran studies designed like this. They would take that cohort of patients that had responded well to antipsychotics, and it's a subset, roughly about 40% of, at least in the old days, of patients initially treated with antipsychotics would still have their psychotic symptoms abated a year later on the drugs, okay? So that would be still in clinical remission. So we would take that subset of patients who responded well, and in half we would abruptly withdraw the antipsychotic, and in the other half we would maintain them on the drug, and with great regularity, those withdrawn from the medication relapsed at a higher rate. Relapse meaning they had a return of psychotic symptoms. So doctors said, look, you withdraw the drug and the disease returns. And that's what they say. Therefore, staying on the drug reduces the chance that the disease will return. And it's those studies, and they're really all abrupt withdrawal. There's really very few gradual withdrawal studies that are the basis for long-term use of antipsychotics. And really, that's the same thing for antidepressants, okay? Okay, now my next step as a journalist, trying to put this conventional wisdom under a microscope, is to see, first of all, is there a flaw with the long-term relapse studies? And really, the relapse studies have two flaws to them. One is just the design of the studies, the abrupt withdrawal, okay? Because we actually know when you withdraw a drug abruptly, it can trigger sort of withdrawal symptoms. So we don't really know that relapse rate when people are withdrawn. Is it due to the return of the disorder, or is it a withdrawal effect? Okay, we don't know. Second of all, although we do know this, the few studies that have been done with gradual withdrawal, the relapse rate is much lower than an abrupt withdrawal. So we know that some of this high relapse rate is a withdrawal effect. Even more profound is sort of the Hippocratic Oath question. I'll get this into a second. Now imagine a study that goes like this. Half the patients who come into an emergency room are treated initially with antipsychotics. They got psychotic symptoms. And now the other half is treated with psychosocial care, but not put on drug. Okay. And now we follow both groups for 3 years, 5 years, and we look at what they're working, symptomatic, socialization. Do we know what the long-term course of, say, unmedicated psychosis is? The relapse studies don't tell us that, right? They don't tell us anything sort of about the natural course and really the natural capacity to recover over time. So those are the flaws. They're pretty easily recognized. Now my next step, and I hope you see what we're doing here tonight, is try to go through a logical process. Because what I'm going to present you with is two stories. Really part of the social responsibility is, do we want to cling to the old one, or do we want to cling to this other one? So the next step is this. I searched the literature for researchers who tried to address this question. Do antipsychotics improve the long-term outcome of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders? And it's asked this very question I'm asking in this book. And what you find when you do that is this. The researchers say, we have no such evidence. So 2002, Emmanuel Stipp, he's a famous psychiatrist from the University of Montreal, he says, are neuroleptics, that's another word for antipsychotics, effective in treating schizophrenia after 50 years? And he says, when it comes to long-term evidence, there is no compelling evidence on the matter. And then he really says something that I would say is the question that all of our society needs to address. He says, one thing is for sure. We run a let's see if I can get this right. If we wish to base psychiatry on evidence-based medicine, we take a real risk in taking a closer look at what has long been considered true. And that is what I do in this book. And what you all are doing if you read the book and try to assess what it might mean to you and to social care. to try to figure out how antipsychotics shape long-term outcomes, just after you've read, researchers say we just don't have the evidence. But what I did in this book, and I do this for different disorders. I do it for schizophrenia, I do it for depression, I do it for anxiety, I do it for bipolar disorder, and then I also do it for some childhood disorders. Is I tried to put together pieces of a puzzle, a story of science as it unfolds over time, over 50 years. Okay, does that make sense? And the process goes like this. It begins with trying to understand the Hippocratic Oath. Now, what does the Hippocratic Oath say?
First, no harm.
Okay. What does that mean? You think it means don't make the patient worse, right? It means something much more subtle and profound. What Hippocrates was saying is there is often a natural capacity in nature to recover from illnesses, whatever they might be. And in order to understand if your medical intervention is not doing harm, you have to have some understanding that you're improving on nature. This is much more subtle. Imagine you have a therapy that ends like this. We're going to just do a speculation, hypothetical. Let's say you have a certain disease. You give them an intervention. 50% are cured and 50% stay the same. No one gets worse. Have you met the Hippocratic Oath? No one got worse. You don't know. Now let's say you find that the natural spectrum of outcomes is 70% recover and 30% stay the same. Now you actually see your worsening outcomes in the aggregate, okay? So the point is, we need to start with trying to understand what's the capacity to recover from depression, anxiety, manic depressive illness, psychosis, what we call schizophrenia. And when you do that, for all the disorders, and we can start with schizophrenia, here is one extraordinary surprise. You find that when you start to try to flesh out the natural outcomes, an extraordinary capacity to recover. A lot of resilience. And this includes psychosis. You will find that, and there's Samuel Bacco, and then I'll get into the schizophrenia data in just a second. A famous doctor named Samuel Bacco had said this about the natural course of disorders. My experience teaches me that most major mental disorders, especially the most severe, are largely self-limiting in nature, episodic, unless we do something to turn them chronic. And that's his concern. Okay? How about what was first episode schizophrenia like in 1945 to 1955? Real quickly, you see outcomes like this. You follow a first episode cohort. Was in there hospitalized for the first episode, and you look at how they're doing 5 years later. And it's roughly this. 1/3 of the patients just aren't psychotic anymore. Okay? They had a schizophrenic time. There's another third that in fact still have some symptoms, but they're able to live independently in the community. So if you look from 1945 to 1955, 5 years out, about 2/3 of the, quote, first episode schizophrenia patients were living independently in the community 5 years later. More than 50% were employed. And that's sort of our beginning baseline moment. And the outcomes for major depression are even more sort of episodic. Okay, next thing what you do, real quickly, as you try to put together the story, and let's just follow the antipsychotics. You look at the first long-term study. It's done in the 1960s. It has 4 arms. 3 drug-treated group, 1 placebo group. At the end of 6 weeks, the drug-treated group is doing better. But then comes the curiosity. When they follow up at the end of 1 year, they know it's the drug-treated patients that are most likely to be re-hospitalized. And at this very early moment in the literature, we see the vaguest hint of a paradox. Short-term efficacy, but perhaps long-term primacy. The next sort of thing I looked at, what did physicians say when the drugs were being introduced? Because they now were used to seeing people treated without the drugs, and now they're going to be seeing people treated with the drugs. Do they notice anything different? What's their clinical perceptions? And it goes like this. Boy, my patients are getting better faster. But, boy, are they coming back to the hospital in droves. this time, really in the 1960s you first see it, to see this new pattern in their patients. They get discharged, they come back. The other thing you hear is this. It seems that when patients relapse on drug, their relapses are more severe than when on placebo. So this is the other one. Going forward, the next thing I looked at was their retrospective study, a study where someone had 5-year data from a hospital, outcomes data, and now he compares it to 5-year data in a drug area. Sanborn Lockover did that. He had a group of patients treated with psychosocial care at Boston Psycho-Pharmacalogical Hospital in 1947. Similar group of patients in 1967. What does he report? 2 things. In 67, there's a higher relapse rate, and even much more important, whereas 76% of his patients in the 1947 cohort were living independently, now most are on disability, etc. So there's much more social dependency. So we looked at the retrospective study, and Sanborn Lockover says, if we want to think about long-term clinical outcomes, maybe we need to rethink the long-term use of antipsychotics. Okay, that's the retrospective study. Then real quickly, there were 3 studies done in the 1970s funded by the NIH that sought to re-examine this long-term question. And these studies all were basically designed like this. We're going to have one group treated conventionally with drugs, and over here we're going to have a group treated with psychosocial care. We will delay initial use of antipsychotics. If people don't get better after 6 weeks, 10 weeks, we may use antipsychotics. I will tell you in every instance, the experimental group did better. That was one finding. The second finding was that each time there was a subset of first episode patients that could get better without going on drug and then stay better throughout, say, 1, 2, 3 years. And it was that subset that was able to get through their first crisis, so to speak, without going on drug, that each time would have the best long-term outcomes. 3 such studies done in the NIMH. Each time, and this is at the very heart of our research, each time the researchers said this: if we care about long-term outcomes and long-term functional outcomes, we may need to rethink our use of these drugs. Okay?
What is that acronym?
What's that?
The acronym. Who did the study?
Oh, no, NIMH is the National Institute of Mental Health. So this is our top funding agency for mental health. It's part of the National Institute of Health. And then there's this really profound question that arises by William Carpenter, who is at the NIMH. He says this: we know that once you're on medication, you're less likely to relapse and maintain it. But we raised the possibility that over the long term, the drugs are actually making people more biologically vulnerable to psychosis. So what would be happening if we never put people on drugs to begin with? It's really a fundamental question that arises in 1978. And you can see how it arises, right? It arises from this research. The next thing you have is you have doctors at McGill University who say, I think we know what's happening. And it goes back to this, what happened to the brain. Antipsychotics work by blocking dopamine receptors in the brain. They thwart dopamine transmission, acting as a brake. The brain responds by putting down the accelerator. It does so in 2 ways. The presynaptic neurons put out more dopamine. Postsynaptic neurons increase the density of the dopamine receptors. You're now super sensitive to dopamine. This is your new brain, right? Now take away the drug. See the problem? You have that, your brain's been modified. And they said, this is why we're getting such relapses when you come off the drug. And then they also said this, though. Maybe over the long term, we're going to actually have something called tardive psychosis, where the psychosis seeps in because of this dopamine supersensitivity and becomes ever more severe. So they raise that flag of worry. Okay? I'm just trying to show the progress, the process here. That worry arises, you can see how it arises, and then this line of investigation is shut off, 1980s. And basically, I hate to say it, the American Psychiatric Association has guild interests, drugs its product, and they say, we are not going to investigate this anymore. And it's shut off. Okay? And you can see it's confusing, right? You do have short-term efficacy. You got people seeing that when they come off the drugs, they do poorly. And the irony is science is saying, nevertheless, we seem to be shaping outcomes towards greater chronicity. It's sort of a paradox, right? It's hard to deal with. Anyway, if you go forward, what do you find from that just in antipsychotics? Well, one, you find that animal models support the idea that the problem is when these drugs cause an increase in dopamine receptors that makes the brain more sensitive to dopamine over the time. This makes you more biologically vulnerable to psychosis. That's one thing we have. We have cross-cultural studies done by the World Health Organization that compared outcomes in India, Colombia, and Nigeria, 3 developing countries, with outcomes in the US and 6 rich countries. There was one 2-year study, one 5-year study, and what the WHO investigators concluded, each time the outcomes were much better in the poor countries, okay? The 3 developing countries. And the researchers concluded, and listen to this, living in a developed country is, quote, a strong predictor. You won't have a complete remission from schizophrenia. You see there's something wrong with that, right? And then after the first such study, they hypothesized, maybe the problem is that maybe the reason for that is that patients in the poor countries are more medication compliant. It's a valid hypothesis, right? If medication compliance is so key, in other words, if we believe that the drugs are so essential, medication compliance should improve outcomes. But they found that, in fact, the medications were used differently in the poor countries. They were used acutely, short-term, but only 16% of patients were regularly maintained on the drugs. They had a different paradigm of use. So we have that. By the way, I'm just going to stop here for a second. The whole purpose of this book, it's not a medical advice book, right? It's just taking a big picture look. No one should read this book and make any personal decision about medication use. Certainly should not make any decision after this talk. It's just looking big picture, okay? And we may find paradigms of care where some people do better on meds long term, and maybe selective use models. We're just trying to take a big picture, okay? Next thing, you look at MRI studies. MRI studies are a little startling around antipsychotics. The MRI studies have shown that there is some brain volume loss over time with antipsychotics. And they have also shown that as that brain volume loss happens, you get some cognitive impairment, some functional impairment, etc. And increased emotional lethargy. That's that. And then finally, we have one longitudinal study, and it's the only such study that I know of in the literature. It was done by Martin Harrow at the University of Illinois. He, in late 70s, 1980s, he began following 200 newly psychotic patients. Okay, he follows them for 15 and actually now 20 years. And of the 200, he keeps 145 in his study, which is really good to follow that many people that long. He ends up with 64 schizophrenic, people diagnosed with schizophrenia, 81 with milder psychotic disorders. Okay? And all he does, everybody treated conventionally in the hospital with drugs, then they're discharged, and then they're just free to do whatever they do. Some people will go off, some people will stay on, and the purpose of this study, the reason you all funded it, it's funded by the NIH, was to see what happens to people who go off their meds long term. Because the understanding, of course, is they do horribly. So what did he find? Let's just look at the schizophrenic group real quickly. At the end of 2 years, 25 of the 64 at this time, this would not happen today because not many people get off today, but 25 of the 64 were off their antipsychotic medications, and they were doing slightly better than those on meds, okay? And then we see something in this literature we don't see anywhere else in the scientific literature. We see between year 2 and 4.5 a lot of improvement in the off-med group, whereas the on-med group just sort of stays the same. Such that by the end, it's the only place in the literature you see long-term healing, let's say. It's the only time we capture it. Anyway, at the end of 4.5 years, the recovery rate for those on medication, off medication is 40%, those on medication 5%. So it's an 8-fold higher recovery rate. And it stays that way throughout the 15 years. And there's other data like this. If you look at the spectrum of outcomes among those on medication, it's off medication, 40% recovery, 46% so-so, and 44% so-so, 16% uniformly poor. For those on medication, it's 5% recovery, 46% so-so, 49% uniformly poor. So what you see is worse outcomes in the aggregate in the medicated group. And in the other psychotic disorders thing, it's the same thing. It's the off-med group that does better long-term. Now, I'm not saying that this proves anything. I'm just saying it's part of the puzzle we see. And by the way, in terms of psychotic symptoms, those on meds, roughly 70% were still having psychotic symptoms at 10 and 15 years. Only 23% or 25% off meds were still having psychotic symptoms. So what you do at least see in this data is a subset of people who got off and did very well. Anyway, what I'm trying to show you here is that do we have science? Does it tell us a story, a puzzle, that really belies the common wisdom? Our common wisdom is that if you have a psychotic disorder, you have to be in drugs for life, right? That's the standard of care. And what you see in this history is a very different story. You see a lot of capacity to recover, at least in subsets of patients. And really what you're seeing is, on the whole, I'm not saying that some people don't benefit, but on the whole, you're seeing worsening outcomes. So for example, remember that beginning employment rate of about 50%? Remember we talked about that? In the off-med antipsychotic group, more than 50% were employed today. You know what it was in the medicated group? About 5%. So all I'm saying is we have this story of science really of, in the aggregate, outcomes really being worsened. At least that's what I think the science shows. Anyway, I can tell a similar story for antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents, etc. And what I believe science is telling us, time and time again, when we put together this story, is this paradigm of care is in fact increasing the chronicity of these disorders. That's what I believe the science shows. Now let's just go for the 2 years. Don't believe that, okay? It's just, I'm telling you what the book shows. So now we really have 2 stories out there, right? We have the story of medical advances, a lot of drugs, academic medicine behind it, conventional wisdom behind it, right? That's our starting point. Now I write a book that says something different. It really challenges this belief system. And it challenges it, I think, in a profound way. If you read this book, and if you believe that this science is persuasive, it really becomes a call to change. Okay? Because we do want to help people get well long-term. That's a value we share. And so it's a call to change. And that's really this fundamental tension that I think the book presents to you all, to society, etc. And now what Marcia asked me to do is sort of look at what can we learn from the response and what's happened in 2 years about that essential question, etc. Well,
They said the good, the bad, and the brilliant.
Okay.
Okay?
Not
You
sure
can
about
start wherever you want.
I'm not sure about the brilliance, but anyway.
Well, it's right there. It's right there.
Anyway, the day my book was published, so imagine people behind this essential, the accepted wisdom. Do you think they're going to like this book?
They're going to burn it.
They're not going to be happy, okay? And boy, did they strike back. Boy, was there a strike back, and it was really well done. The day my book was published in my local newspaper, the Boston Globe, there was a review by a doctor who had never before written a review for the Boston Globe. Was in a department at Children's Hospital that was heavily subsidized by the pharmaceutical industry. And here's what the review said. It compared me to an AIDS denier, and it compared me to a South African dictator who, by having denied AIDS, caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. Now, I have to tell you, when you get up in the morning in your local paper, and you're compared to an AIDS denier, this is not the best book launch ever. I have to say this was really smart, really well done. I still feel like clapping, so to speak, because it worked. This was my 4th book. My first 3 books actually got some attention, some sort of awards or recognition as notable books of the year. Everything shut down. All radio interviews canceled, and no other newspaper reviewed the book at that point. There was a couple little reviews. There was a little review in Time magazine that actually was quite good. A review in the New Scientist. Other than that, it was shut out, and sales just didn't happen because there was no notice. Really well done. So what happened then? Because of that in America, I was somewhat known by certain peer groups, that sort of thing, and they began reading the book. And then the next thing that happened that sort of became a way to look at what maybe was happening with what, how can I put this?
Perspective.
Yeah, perspective. Anyway, what happened was I was invited to become the keynote speaker at the annual Alternatives Conference. This is a conference somewhat, Amy in the back is laughing at this, she knows this story. The Alternatives Conference is a conference organized by people, peers, that's paid for by SAMHSA. I was asked to be the keynote, and then I was disinvited to give the keynote. There obviously been some complaint, and why are you going to have this person give this talk? And then what happened is the peer community rallied. They began calling the White House, they began calling SAMHSA, etc., and saying, why isn't this person being allowed to speak? Now, I was re-invited. I was re-invited with a caveat. Imagine if you're a keynote speaker and they say, here's the new deal. You will give a keynote speech, and then we will have a psychiatrist come up and say what an idiot you are. And you won't be allowed to respond. And that was the deal. Now, normally you would probably say no thanks. But I was so moved, frankly, by people rallying. I said, what the heck, this is fantastic. Really to honor the people who had rallied to my side. Now, at this point, the person who's been picked to give the rebuttal, so to speak, he goes to, I'm letting you think behind the scenes, he goes to an academic medical center and he says, tell me where Whitaker's wrong. Prepare the rebuttal. Okay? And I then got leaked what I believe was the response to him. And the rebuttal was this. Unfortunately, he's very accurate. And so when you saw the rebuttal, it went like this at Alternatives. One, Whitaker focuses our attention on a car wreck. We really should look at the freeways. And that was number one, not exactly a scientific rebuttal. And the second was this, even I guessed a little bit of this one. Yeah, maybe the drugs make people worse over the long term, but that's true of a lot of drugs. It's not just psychiatric drugs. I kid you not. So going forward, what then began to happen? That put the book a bit on, out there. And then things began to happen. I began to hear from some psychiatrists. I began to hear from some psychologists saying, I read your book, I'm upset. What do we do about this? Began putting those people together on the internet during listservs. And by the way, Oregon really was a leader in this. Okay? Specifically, it began in Lane County with a gentleman named Bruce Abel. And he said, we want to have a symposium to really discuss this. And at this point, I managed to get a donor to fund the symposium. And in order to give the donor some money, we had to form a nonprofit. And that eventually turned into something called the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care. I'll talk to you a little bit more about what they're doing. Now, at this symposium that was held in Portland in February of 2011, I don't even know what decade it is. It was really interesting. There were 4 workshops. A workshop on schizophrenia and antipsychotics, antidepressants, a workshop on medication tapering, and a workshop on sort of Medicaid reimbursement. What was really interesting about the workshops was we got academic medical doctors to read the workshops and to go over the data in Anatomy of an Epidemic in anticipation. And the idea was they would go over the data and decide should protocols be changed. Okay? Academic doctors. Now, the workshop done by antipsychotics was led by 2 Harvard-affiliated doctors, Chris Gordon and Mark Green. And I will tell you what Mark Green called me up when he read the book, and he says, give me a week and I'll tell you where you're wrong. I know this is not true. A week later he says, damn it, I haven't found out where you're wrong yet. Anyway, they led the workshop, and and there was one other interesting thing, and let's just put it this way. There were some doctors psychiatrists sent to that workshop with some academic credentials who were ordered to make sure nothing nothing worthwhile came out of that workshop. They were basically sent there to sabotage the deal. And they were sabotaging the morning. I sat in as a fly on the wall. And then some people who had looked at the literature said, well, what about the Harrow study? What about this? They hadn't read it. So they read that study, and they came back. These people sent to sabotage it and said, boy, you've rocked our world. And here what was so profound about this. After 2 days, that schizophrenia workshop came up with 2 principles. They said there's an evidence base for avoiding initial use of the neuroleptics, because if you do that, there will be a group of people who will get better without going on the drugs, and that group of patients can have a good long-term outcome. Remember that thought, okay? Because we're going to see if maybe that possibility is now going to be investigated. And then the second thing they said, even once you use the meds, it's clear that some can do okay off, and they should be given a chance to go off. So what they were saying is we need to rethink the use of antipsychotics along this selective use model. And that's what came out of the symposium, where people spent weeks and months looking at the literature there, and they changed their minds. The antidepressant workshop went through a somewhat similar process. They came up with these principles. In terms of over the short term, antidepressants really aren't very effective, more effective than placebo for mild to moderate depression. And you really should try other things like depression, exercise, other sort of psychosocial thing before you use antidepressants. And that really you only see real effectiveness over placebo in more severely depressed patients. Then the second thing they initially concluded in the workshop was, and you shouldn't use the drugs longer than a year, if at all possible, because there is increasing evidence that the drugs may be depressogenic, increase the chronicity of the disorder over the long term. Now again, that does not mean nobody does well on the drugs long term. It just means you're increasing chronicity in the aggregate, okay? Now when they brought that to the larger symposium, that sort of stirred a ruckus, and they backed off, and they just said, okay, there's no evidence that the drugs necessarily help long term, okay? But again, these were symposiums where they looked at this, and they altered conventional beliefs, which you can see was quite... For me, it was rewarding because it sort of was validation, etc. By the way, this was the day. It was the same weekend that Rethinking Psychiatry was formed in February of 2011.
That was a busy weekend for you.
That was a busy weekend. So, I could go forward with this. What's the next sort of story to tell on this? One is actually, I think, sort of an increasing societal acceptance that something needs to be thought about. So, for example, the New York Review of Books is a very prestigious publication. A woman named Marcia Angel, she's the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. That's a very prestigious journal. She did a 2-part front-page review of my book and 2 other books. The other one was Daniel Carlot's Unhinged and Irving Kirsch's The Emperor's New Drugs. And basically she said, boy, there's something wrong here. And we really need to look at this. Then Marcia Angel started getting targeted for reviews started going her way. It was nice to have that way. But the point of this was that there was some recognition this was a valid thing for society to be thinking about. At that point, 60 Minutes contacted us all 3. And then they decided to focus on antidepressants. And I don't know if you saw that 60 Minutes piece. They basically followed Irving Kirsch's work showing that antidepressants are really effective over the short term only in very severely depressed patients. By effective, I mean more effective than placebo. So you start to see there some acceptance. See what I'm saying? Society start changing. And I do want to say about the investigative reporters and the Editors Association Award, just as a sign of increasing recognition, maybe we need to look at this. If you Google me, you will see some pretty negative things. You will see he's biased, he's slanted, he's cherry-picked his studies. You'll see other criticisms. You almost cannot see anything that does not have the word controversial before my name now. It seems like it's my middle name. But the Investigative Reporters and Editors Association is an association of people at the New York Times, 60 Minutes, Washington Post, etc. And it was set up after Watergate to honor investigative journalism. And the media on this particular story has generally really repeated the common wisdom. So for them to give this book this award was really sort of a sense of them saying, maybe we need to look at this. Maybe there's something here. It was sort of a validation.
Bob, didn't Marcia's Angels, didn't she win an award for her?
Yeah, she wrote a book
Might
called The
mention
Truth About Drug Companies some years earlier.
Oh, I thought she won an award for her.
Review? I don't know, something similar. So finally, one last thing on this, about being on the road 180 days or whatever, I don't know, I'm just on the road pretty constantly. I'm increasingly going to other countries, and society after society is asking the same question. Is this working? I will really tell you, societies are really trying to struggle. Does this paradigm of care, which emphasizes drugs as the cornerstone, is it helping alleviate the burden of distress? And as part of my going around there, I will tell you, every society I go to, they're all seeing soaring disability rates. Denmark, doubled in the last 10 years. Iceland, quadrupled in the last 15, 20 years. UK, same thing. Australia, New Zealand. Wherever you see this, you're seeing these soaring disability rates. So you can see why we're talking, why societies are worrying about this. A couple other things. What science has come out, we're going to do two more things. What science has emerged since I wrote this book? Does it invalidate or does it further validate? And also, what are changes that are happening? That's what we're focusing on. Real quickly, as you saw with the alternative story, nothing was really came out to say, here's our evidence showing that medications shape long-term outcomes for the benefit. It's been 2 years. I've been on panels. I've been in many forums. I've never seen anybody say, here's our studies that show we're improving long-term outcomes. So it's been 2 years. And I think they would have found it if it were there. The other thing is, and I'm just telling you this, I've been accused of being slanted, biased, cherry picking, etc. But no one has said, here's the studies he missed. Here's the studies he miscited. No researcher has contacted me and said, you miscited my data in 2 years. So I haven't had that sort of attack on the reporting. And I just think it's important for really myself as a reporter, but if we're going to take seriously this other possibility, you would hope that there hasn't been this attacks on the reporting. Okay, real quickly, how about the chemical imbalance story? Well, it is officially being abandoned. 2010, Thomas Insel, he's the director of the NIH, he says this. Really, this was a bad piece of logic. There's no reason to think that just because the drugs do this, the disease is the opposite. Okay, he wrote this paper. But here's my favorite abandonment of the chemical imbalance story. It's by Ronald Pies. He's an editor at Psychiatric Times, and it was written in 2011. Here's what he says. I am not one who easily loses his temper, but I confess to experiencing markedly increased limbic activity whenever I hear someone proclaim, psychiatrists think all mental disorders are due to a chemical imbalance. In the past 30 years, I don't think I have ever heard a knowledgeable, well-trained psychiatrist make such a preposterous claim, except perhaps to mock it. On the other hand, the chemical imbalance trope has been tossed around by opponents of psychiatry who mendaciously attribute the phrase to psychiatrists themselves. You all see what's going on here? In truth, the chemical imbalance notion was always a kind of urban legend, never a theory seriously propounded by well-informed psychiatrists. I have to say, that's the biggest retreat from a story I have ever seen. And now people like me are said to have attributed to psychiatrists and they never said it. Anyway, but the point is, there is full-fledged retreat from that, even though I recently was in a room full of people who had a psychiatric diagnosis, and I asked them, how many of you were ever told you had a chemical imbalance? In this room, let's imagine everyone had a diagnosis. What percentage of hands went up? 100%. Okay, that's one bit of research. Second, we have some more research done on animal models of antipsychotics. It's done by Philip Seaman at the University of Toronto, and he's done some research related to this increase in dopamine receptors, and he recently published a paper saying, this is why the drugs fail over time. And I'll just say, we show that during ongoing treatment with clinically relevant doses, Haldol and Zyprexa progressively lose their efficacy. The loss of efficacy is linked to an increase in dopamine receptor number and sensitivity. These results are the first to demonstrate that breakthrough supersensitivity during ongoing antipsychotic treatment undermines treatment efficacy. So there's further research sort of worrying about this dopamine supersensitivity.
What did you say about breakthrough?
Meaning what he's saying is initially the drugs work, okay? And by blocking dopamine receptors, but then over time the drugs cause an increase in dopamine receptors. And that's why you get this lack of efficacy.
I was on Zyprexa and I had breakthrough mania, and they were telling me that I didn't take my medication. And I had taken my medication all the time, but I still had a manic episode.
Well, this is basically saying that this is a progression that happens over time. How about antidepressants? Well, there's been a lot more research about maybe that they're depressogenic over the long term, and in 2011, researchers at the University of Louisville wrote a paper on this very problem. His name is Reef L. Malik, is the leading researchers on this, and here's what he writes. These drugs may, and he talks about the worsening outcomes for depression long term. He says these drugs may have a pro-depressive effect over the long term. That is, continued drug treatment may induce processes that are the opposite of what the medication originally produced. He's talking about that decrease in serotonergic receptors. And this may cause a worsening of the illness, continued for a period of time after discontinuation of the medication, and may not be reversible. So the worry is that you're driving the brain into sort of a depressed state long term. He concludes, a chronic and treatment-resistant depressive state is proposed to occur in individuals who are exposed to potent antagonists of serotonin reuptake pumps, those are SSRIs, for prolonged time periods. Due to the delay in the onset of this chronic depressive state, it is labeled tardive dysphoria. Tardive dysphoria manifests as a chronic dysphoric state that is initially transiently relieved by, but ultimately becomes unresponsive to, antidepressant medication. SSRIs may be of particular importance in the development of tardive dysphoria. All I'm saying in that paper, you see a recognition of the same science I was writing about in the book. This worry that we're changing an episodic illness into a more chronic disorder. Finally, I will say that Martin Harrell just published his 20-year data on his long-running study of schizophrenia patients and mildly psychotic patients, and the outcomes keep on diverging. I will just give you one bit of additional fact from that study. He breaks out in one time patients that were medication compliant for this 20 years and those who got off in 2 years and then stayed off for the next 18 years. He compared those two outcomes. Now, he had, again, a definition of recovery. You had to be working for 50% of the time, right? Of those who were medication compliant for the 20 years, only 17% ever entered a period of recovery, meaning they were working half-time. Of those who got off by year 2 and stayed off, 87% experienced 2 or more periods of recovery. You see the difference, 87 versus 17%? So he says this. He also notes those with mood disorders who got off antipsychotics were much more likely to recover. Those who stayed on had poor long-term functioning, which was, quote, consistent with the data on the poorer long-term functioning of the schizophrenia patients who were on antipsychotics. And then he raises this question. Is very long-term treatment with antipsychotic medication undesirable? That's what he raises, not me. Okay? Now, as I will say is you can see a validation of the question. And again, I want to emphasize something really strongly here. This is not medical advice, that's number 1. And 2, I personally believe the drugs can be helpful in the short term and some people benefit from them long term, okay? But it's just, we're just looking big picture, okay? All right, how about what else is happening? I think you see in this science some confirmation that these are problems to worry about. What has been the response from psychiatrists? As you might have mentioned, might imagine, a lot of hostility. But there has been some real cracking open of psychiatry. And it goes like this. At some point, Maine Psychiatry, the group as the Maine Psychiatric Association, invited me to come talk to them. We talked. It was tense. And here's what they finished up. Oh, by the way, just one small thing. I was flying back from Portland when I came into this. I fly back on a red eye. I get to Boston. I'm tired. I drive up to Boston. I drive up to Portland, Maine. I swear to God, I get there, and the psychiatrist rolls up his sleeves and he goes, "It's time to take off the gloves." That was the beginning of that talk. But here's how it ended. This group put out a notice on the listserv, and they said this was one of the most important meetings they had, and they urged other psychiatric groups across the country to start dealing with this. So you saw a mind cracking open. Since then, I've been asked to give grand rounds at some other medical schools. Some of them have gone well, some of them haven't gone so well. But Massachusetts General Hospital, University of Vermont, I was just out in Berkeley. I have something at, where am I going next week? University of Kentucky, I'm going to University of Alabama, and I could name some others. It's a sign that, you know what grand rounds are? Grand rounds is when they bring in people to talk theoretically about some cutting edge thing. It is not normal to bring in a journalist to grand rounds. But the fact that this is happening shows that at some level, the profession itself is saying, boy, we really need to think about that. That's really what's happening. By the way, I met with the Vermont Psychiatric Association, and they were really on board with, maybe we need to rethink this. So I think you're seeing within the profession some signs of addressing this and thinking about it. Believe it or not, eventually I was asked, and again, this was thankful to someone from Oregon. Do you all know David Paul, by any chance? Does that name ring a bell? He's an Oregon psychiatrist, pretty well known. He's got a long history in the APA. He got me invited to speak at the American Psychiatric Association last fall in San Francisco. It was at their second meeting of the year. It said that's a meeting of like Institute of Community Psychiatry, something like that. And here was the thing. You'll see the tension here. So, I was invited to give a talk. Was invited before Martial Angel's review came out, and after Martial Angel's review came out, the APA, his organization, sort of put out a press release denouncing me. So I was invited to speak, but being denounced at the same time. They assigned me a room at 8 o'clock Saturday morning. People would not be awake. That was number one. Two, they initially were going to have continuing medical education credits. They withdrew the credits. Three, they normally videotape and record the talks and they make it part of a disc. They wouldn't do that either. Okay, it was sort of no longer an official part of the program. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. There was so much interest, they were asked to move it to a bigger room. The room that was in maybe held 300 people. Now the association refused to move it, but nevertheless there was this interest. The place was utterly packed. There were 350 people out in the hall trying to get in. And there was a lot of younger psychiatrists there. And afterwards they were coming up saying, and it was actually a pretty respectful audience. Questions were good. And a lot of the younger ones, I will tell you, came up afterwards and said to me this. They felt like suing their medical schools for malpractice. But the point is really that these were people opening up their minds, right? And it really speaks well. A couple of weeks ago, I was asked to speak to the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry. I don't know if you know that group. It's sort of a think tank for the American Psychiatric Association. If you go there, there are former heads of the APA. It is filled with people who've been high up in the NIMH. It is filled with chairs of the psychiatric departments at medical schools. It's a powerful group. Again, it's a think tank. There were many people in that book, many people there that were named in the book. Not all in flattering lights. It was very tense. I'll give you a real quick thing. First, I met with 4 different groups, the Psycho-Pharmacology Committee, preliminary lecture. The first meeting was with the psycho-pharmacology committee. You can imagine, tense. Really tense. But at the end of the day, we went through this. That committee told me, okay, we're going to start looking at medication tapering protocols. And think about that. Again, I think what you're seeing is the power of science to say maybe we should rethink this paradigm of care. And this is at the very heart of things. Anyway, and I actually, by the way, I spoke to the child psychiatry group. And there was about 30 people. And if there was any moment it was tense, it was that. Because those of you who've read the book, really talks a lot about, are we helping these children or not? And the child psychiatry group, at one point I said to them, can you point to research that is showing that we're helping these kids grow up and thrive? And they said they couldn't. They talked about short-term relief, but they said we don't have that data. And within that group, there was a lot of talk about changing what they were doing and using drugs more short-term, tapering kids off. And what I'm trying to say here is, there is an element out there within psychiatry that is opening its mind to really looking at this science and perhaps rethinking things. Now, it's just one element. I will tell you as I go around and give different talks, often talks are boycotted. Psychiatrists won't show up. I see that all the time. And sometimes even in these, at the grand rounds at the Oakland Hospital a couple of weeks ago, it was basically boycotted. Social workers were there, psychologists, workers there were very few psychiatrists. So I just want to say it's a big battle. There is an element, I think, trying to engage with this material. How about now finding real initiatives? One, we have the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care that formed at this time at this symposium. Again, it is led by Gina Nickel. She's now the executive director. Do you know that name? She's the former director of community mental health programs in Oregon. I think that's it, so it's a mainstream person. Her husband is on the board, Bob Nickel. He used to be the commissioner of mental health in Oregon, so you see that involvement. Anyway, there's a board out there. It has a scientific advisory committee. I think they've raised around $3 million now. They're hoping to raise $200 million, and I'll talk about Oregon in a second. They're now starting to fund research. Now, one of the first programs they're going to fund is an early intervention program for first episode psychosis that will be modeled on a very successful form of care done in Western Lapland, in which they delay the initial use of antipsychotics, but throw a lot of psychosocial care at it. Okay? This type of research hasn't been done since the 1970s. This will be the first time they revisit this question. Can we help some people get through their first psychotic break without going on medications and turn it back into an episodic illness? So they funded that. I think they're looking to get IRB approval from Boston University. IRB is the institutional review board that assesses whether this is an ethical thing to do. And I will tell you, they could not get IRB approval unless they became convinced this was an evidence-based thing to do, that there was a rationale for that. So this is an example of research that's being funded, of positive change. It's something that we're going to investigate a question that hasn't been investigated for 30-some years. They're also looking at funding long-term research into children, etc. Another thing, by the way the foundation is being done, it's like a community foundation, and they're having all these sub-foundations. So let's say a donor wants to say, I will give $300,000 for a first episode project in Georgia. Then they set up a sub-foundation to make that happen. Well, and there's different donors coming forth, I want to do this, I want to do that, and setting that up. But one of the possibilities that is now being discussed is an Oregon Foundation fund. And I think there's some money maybe coming into it, and that is to fund projects here in Oregon that will look at doing things differently. Now, one place that there is something on the drawing board is in Southern Oregon, which is where I came from yesterday and the weekend before. There's a psychiatrist down there named Ted Sundin, who, over the past 6 months, he formed 2 book groups. One was a book group of general practitioners, family care physicians, basically family care physicians, and then he had a second book group of psychiatrists was real interesting that Ted will talk about. The psychiatrists this was really difficult. And I mean this in an empathetic way. Imagine you're a psychiatrist, you've been taught something, you've been doing something, and now you're being asked to confront data that says maybe that wasn't so good. That's really hard. It's really hard to confront that. And I think as Ted was saying, it's a real process to try to come through, start there, and end up somewhere else. As Ted says, Dr. Sunday, he says, he's been struggling with it for 6 months. And he says there's sort of 2 questions. If I believe this, how do I forgive myself? How many patients have I harmed? And how do I go to work tomorrow? It's 2 really difficult questions. And I think we have to understand that it really is difficult. Nevertheless, he's got the medical community sort of investigating this. And what's happening now as a result? There was just a conference down there. Well, one thing, I was in a locked facility yesterday morning. 32 beds, I think, 16 forensic patients. And that facility is now committed to trying to set up a program, a protocol to figure out who can taper off their meds. And how to do it. And how to try to do it safely, etc. And again, they're not looking at tapering everybody off their meds. They just want to see those who want to support them in that, and see if they get down to lower doses, etc. That hasn't been done really ever. We're 50 years into this. 50 years of this, and nobody has really tried to see if we support people, what results might we see. And that's what they're talking about doing. Ted and his group down there are also looking to set up a clinic in which you will come into that clinic, and let's say you have depression or some other problem, and the idea is that they will provide you with holistic care, a menu of care. And that care will be like this. They'll try to set you up with exercise as part of an exercise group. They will try to help you with nutrition. They will work on, if you want to meditate, they will work on meditation, spirituality. As Ted says, I don't know anything that's better than helping people go back to work if they're not working. Stable housing, all these sort of psychosocial care, and then they'll think about how to use the medications in some sort of selective, limited, cautious manner. They're not throwing medications out the door, and I don't think they should. The question is really, for whom and for how long? That's a very different question than one size fits all. And if you see Ted, maybe you can get him up here, he's got this new sort of protocol. It's really beautiful, I have to say, because the whole conception begins differently. The whole conception is people come in, they have psychiatric distress, they're human beings, there's a context for distress, right? Sometimes there's a lot going wrong with their lives, and we're going to sort of say, how can we help rebuild social bridges, integration, help them sort of become empowered to sort of learn about their mind, control their mind better, take responsibility, be healthier physically. It's really a very different vision, and he wants to set up a clinic that will provide that, wants to make it into a research study. Again, that will be an example of really rethinking a paradigm of care. By the way, I have a website, madamerica.com, and one of the things we're doing on that website is we're just putting up new research studies that appear. And there is a lot of research coming out about the benefits of hiking, the benefits of walking, the benefits of yoga in a research way, the benefits of nutrition. There is a lot of data coming out about the benefits of psychosocial care, so it's becoming more evidence-based. The third thing, just to tell you an example of what's going on, Ted Sunday has a big group of patients. Basically, it's a bipolar group, and as a group, and I sat in with them yesterday, and there are many people who would like to taper down off their medications. And so he's basically going to, as collectively, as a group, sort of explore this option, tapering down, trying to do it with support. What else do you need? And really being sensitive to each other. And if people need the medications, fantastic. And if some people come off, great. But it's really like a group effort to rethink long-term use of the medications, and that's consistent with some of the data I spoke about. There's some other projects going on in Vermont, where I was asked to speak, and the Commissioner of Mental Health came there. Their state mental hospital was flooded in the fall of this year by a hurricane. They've now set aside a pot of $60 million. They're not going to rebuild, they're not going to build a new hospital there. And one of the things they're looking at doing is perhaps starting Centuria houses. These are for those that you don't know, Centuria, that was one of the projects done in the 1970s that looked to see if you could provide a safe environment for newly psychotic patients and people to be with people. Could you help people, some people, get through their psychotic break without going on meds? The answer was yes. Vermont is looking at that, and now they want to fund such projects. So what I'm saying is you're seeing, I think, these little seeds growing. And they're just tiny little seeds, okay? They really are tiny seeds. It's a big country. I don't know a lot more seeds. Well, I will say one thing. There's a group, there's an association of residential therapeutic communities where people go and stay longer periods of time. I spoke to that group. At least 2 are now sort of trying to provide care for those who want to try to taper off. They will support you on that in sort of farm-like environments and see if it can be done successfully.
Where?
What's that?
Where?
One is in North Carolina. I think one's going to be opening up in St. Louis. And I think there's one in western Massachusetts that's going to begin to do this, and one in Vermont. Again, just small seeds. And I think the possibility is this. Again, we've been living with a really pretty pessimistic vision. And the pessimistic vision we've been living with is you have a broken brain, right? If you have a psychotic episode, if you have a manic episode, if you have depression, you're said to have a chemical imbalance, you need to be on drugs for life, it's a chronic disorder. That's the pessimistic story we've been living with. And drugs are the cornerstone of that. The vision I think that people are struggling towards, whether we get there or not, I'm not sure, is a much more nuanced vision. It's a much more optimistic vision. It's a vision that says it's quite human to have psychiatric distress. God knows why it happens. A lot of different reasons, okay? It's almost a Shakespearean vision. And that is, if you're human, you have a capacity to have a lot of psychiatric distress. And those of us who are English majors know that that's what Shakespeare was telling us. Including psychosis, mania, depression, etc. But the great thing about that vision is that that's your vision, that's your philosophical vision of human beings. It's like this. You can have a time, and if you have certain stresses, you can end up in a place where you need help. Okay? You can have a lot of psychiatric distress, whatever the symptoms may be. But with this vision, the idea is, with the right psychosocial care, you don't remain here. You don't have a broken brain, but you can come back over here and basically have an episode of psychiatric distress. That's really the vision. And we're going to try, and the vision is you can have so many people coming back where it was just episodic. It wasn't a chronic thing. That's the vision. And I think you see it's a much less stigmatizing vision. It's an inclusive vision. It's a vision about human beings. God, we are just emotional creatures. And we go ups and downs. We have our mood fluctuations, etc. But it's a much more tolerant vision. It's an expanded vision of what it means to be human. It's also a vision that talks about resilience. It talks about human beings having this extraordinary capacity to go to difficult moments and with the right care, get better. So it is an optimistic vision. It's also, I think, a vision of a collective responsibility. So right now we say when someone has psychiatric distress, it's your fault. You're the problem. You have the broken brain. We're going to fix you. The new vision is more like this. We as a society have to create better social webs. And if someone has difficulty, we've got to help them find that social web. And a social web is a lot of things. it's housing, it's nutrition, it's things like meaning in life. It's things about like how do you know, promoting friendships, all those things we all need to stay well, both to get well and stay well. I think that's the promise, the hope. And by the way, in this vision of things, it's not that people are saying that the medications may not have a place. Plenty of people are saying maybe you have it as a tool to help you get through that distressful period. And maybe there are some people who will do better long term, even with that tool long term. But it is also a vision of medications where you say maybe some people do better without going on the meds, so you don't have this change in the brain. And many, many people, in fact, will not need the medications long term, just are fine. So I think that's the tension we have here. We have this old belief, produces a lot of profits, there's a lot of prestige invested in this, academic psychiatry, etc. And the question is, whether I believe there's science supporting this other vision. I believe there's a lot of people who would like to embrace this other vision. And the question is, what are we going to have as a society in the future? I don't know. What I think Rethinking Psychiatry is trying to do is at least raise the issue, raise awareness, and have people decide, should we try to go for this other vision? So that's the hope. Boy, I went long. Questions, comments, that's good.
I just want to, we have 15 minutes, so please keep your questions succinct, and this is great, and quite a celebration.
I have a question. I read a book called Future Shock by Alvin Toffler. It was published in 1970. He defined future shock as the human response to overstimulation. Okay. Remember the Lucille Ball comedy routine where she's sitting on a stool and she's picking, there's a conveyor belt going by and she's picking out the bad fruit, throwing it. And then she's working calmly along. Then all of a sudden they speed up the conveyor belt. Okay? And as a result of speeding up the conveyor belt, she gets frustrated. She has anxiety, and then she starts acting out. It's a comedy. It was funny. We all laughed about it. But I think what we're seeing, and I think the reason why so many people have the need for the drugs, is that we're living in a culture that our society that is speeding up so rapidly that our body physiology can't keep up with our technology. And we see it every day. And I think that's the concern that I have when half your tax dollars go to support the military-industrial complex. It's like, we got to look at what's causing people to want the drug. And I think that's one of the biggest problems I'm seeing today is this human response to overstimulation. We're moving at an enormous velocity just with cell phones and computers.
Right. He's raising the question, do we have a healthy society? I personally would agree with you. We don't have a very healthy society. But that's part of the question. So if we don't have a healthy society, are drugs the answer, or do we maybe need to create a healthier society? And I think maybe the answer is we need to create a healthier society. So it's simple.
A couple of things. One, I would like, just because it's being felt it will not be showing us.
Can you speak up?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Could you very quickly share the study about children and how the NIMH heralded the 13-month marker and what happened at the end of that, and then also very quickly share how children of color and foster children are targeted, because I'm going to be using this. So.
Yeah. She's asking two questions. She's asking actually about a long-term study of stimulant medications funded by the NIMH. It's called the MTA Multimodal Study, something like that. It was done in the 1990s when it was launched. The NIMH said this is the first well-designed study of stimulants designed to see, do these medications help children long-term? Okay, that was the purpose of it. And one of the reasons for it was, this was in the early 1990s, they said, we have no evidence that the drugs help long-term. So at the end of 13, and it basically compared stimulants to behavioral care, odd design. After 13 months, there was a big announcement that medicated patients are doing better. A bigger reduction on their ADHD symptoms, that's whatever, hyperactivity, and slightly better on reading. And that was really promoted, big time. We now have long-term evidence that stimulants help. Then they continued following the kids, and at the end of 3 years, they found that being on medication was a marker not of benefit, I'm quoting, but of deterioration by the end of 3 years. At the end of 6 years, those on drugs, in fact, those who had stayed on the stimulants had worse ADHD symptoms, higher delinquency rates, some functional impairment, etc. In other words, and as the lead investigator said when he was in the UK, he will not say this in the US. We had expected that medicated children would do better over the long term, but that is not the case. We found no benefit on any domain of functioning, and that should be made very clear to patients. Those 3-year and 6-year results are never told to patients. They're not publicized, they're not on the NIH websites, highlighted. The APA does not incorporate them into their treatment guidelines, and this is part of the problem that Cindy's talking about. 13-month results are heralded, 3-year and 6-year results are not. And if you're a parent of someone diagnosed with ADHD, what do you want to know? You want to know, is this going to help my kid grow up and thrive? And that information is not being told. That's one answer to Cindy. The second answer to Cindy is this. She was asking, what about African-American children and children in foster care? They're getting hammered. Foster care children in particular are just getting hammered with antipsychotics. I just wrote a chapter in a book on this. Something like 60% of children in foster care by the time they're teenagers are on antipsychotic medications. And if you look as to why that is, it's just behavioral purposes. It's not that they're, quote, psychotic. It just knocks down aggression, makes them sleep longer, that sort of thing. It is a horrible... You know, who are foster children? Foster care children are children who sort of drew a short straw in the lottery of life. They get born into a family that's sort of dysfunctional, right? Difficult. And what are we doing as a society? We're blaming the kid. We're now saying, you've got bipolar or whatever it is, and we're medicating you and giving you antipsychotics. We're the guardians of those kids, right? And that's what we say. So we're medicating those kids. And I will tell you, I have talked to many foster care kids. They are not happy, those who are doing well at age 18 and having spent their youth on antipsychotics. And that's those who are getting off. So if there's any moral question, I'd say this is a really big, important one. You are starting to address it here in Oregon. There's some efforts I know to knock down the use of psychotropic medications in kids. In fact, I heard about this in the main county today. Yeah, next question.
I can't remember what the statistic, what you said. Oh, by the way, my name is Kevin Fitz. I'm the executive director of the Oregon Mental Health Consumers Organization. One of our long-term goals is to put together a care farm for people in acute psychiatric crisis and take away the coercion, the non-violence, and the forced medication and try to work experimentally and stuff like that. So I find this stuff really intriguing. My question is, looking, and I don't know what the statistic you said, $40 billion a year. So I don't know what generation we're at, first, second, or third generation psychiatry. I can't imagine that commerce selling an Abilify pill at $10 a pop is going to go away quietly. And so I wonder, what is science looking at as far as next generation medications and looking at, well, maybe these things cause brain damage or neurotoxicity or whatever, and maybe with computer models, maybe we can do better, any sort of thing like that. And what is your next book going to be?
So the first question is the pharmaceutical industry going to give up a $40 billion industry? No, probably not. By the way, you want to hear something amazing? In 2010, I think it was, antipsychotics were the leading revenue-producing class of drugs in America. Antipsychotics, more than statins, more than any other class of drugs. They generated more revenues than any other class of drugs. And I have to say, we are one psychotic population, I guess.
TV advertising.
Here's the answer in terms of future drug development. drug companies are getting out of the business. And here's what I mean. About 6 major companies have shut down their psychopharmacology research efforts. Why is that? Because after all of these years of investigations into the biology of mental disorders, they don't have a clue. I'm serious. Well, the way drug development works, they try to find molecular targets, right? Promising molecular targets. They don't know what to target, other than to just keep targeting what the previous drugs targeted, which would be more Me Too drugs. And basically they're saying until the science improves, it's just so hard to get a drug that is any better than the old ones. And how are we going to sell our story then? Especially when the population has become so skeptical. This has become so pronounced that Thomas Insel did a paper saying that maybe the government has to start developing drugs. So Thomas Insel is saying, Thomas Insel's paper is really interesting. It goes like this. Chemical imbalance story is not true. Okay? Then we got off the base on that. 2 of these drugs, he says something like, far too people even respond to the drugs, and really far too people recover in the drugs. They're really not very effective. And he says there's no evidence that we're reducing the morbidity or mortality with these drugs. So in other words, 50 years into this, outcomes aren't good. But he says the promised land is near. The promised land is always near. Like, you know, the new genetics, etc. The truth of the matter is there's a real crisis in the field right now because of this lack of biological understanding and new targets. As far as my next book, if I ever stop traveling, I want to do a book on what is science telling us about how to create healthy children, healthy minds, and that sort of thing. Sort of from the womb to age 18. We're not doing, and how do you organize a society to do that? So we're not doing a very good job of that. So,
kind of like Joseph Pierce research.
Exactly. So that's my hope, if I can ever sort of get to that.
If a child grows up on medication as their brain is growing and developing, if they get off meds as an adult, how likely do you think their brain can make a full recovery, or do you think that there'll be permanent damage?
Y'all hear that question? This is really a profound question, thank you. She says this, if you medicate a child, and for years you're sort of saying, right? When the child then gets off the medication as an adult, does the brain sort of heal, or does it return to normal, so to speak? That is a great question. Part of me says yes. One of the great things about the brain is its extraordinary neuroplasticity. And so you will see, for example, this is a sign of the brain to heal. Kids going on antipsychotics actually have a real high rate of tardive dyskinesia. Do you all know what tardive dyskinesia is? You'll see motor tics. You might see the lip going, the mouth, the tongue going around like this. Anyway, you'll see motor tics, etc. And tardive dyskinesia is a sign that the basal ganglia is becoming dysfunctional. So the basal ganglia is the area of the brain that controls motor movement. Now in adults, once it happens, even if you withdraw the offending antipsychotic, often it remains, the tardive dyskinesia, which is a sign that the basal ganglia dysfunction is permanent. Now with antipsychotics in children, the risk of TD is actually higher. Okay? But the good news is, if you withdraw it, you see a lot of resolution of the TD, which is a sign that the brain is healing itself. That's the good news, okay? Here's some recent really upsetting news, which I was just researching. If you look at kids going on SSRIs as they enter puberty, then they go to college. Now, one of the things that's real well known with SSRIs is some sexual dysfunction. Okay? It's a real well-known side effect. 60–70%. There's a diminishment of arousal. There's some diminishment of, if you can orgasm, sort of orgasmic pleasure, that sort of thing. There's a diminishment of bonding, etc. So as you might imagine, a lot of kids that are on SSRIs, they go to college, and what do they say? My friends are having sex. They seem to be enjoying it. I would like to have sex. So what a lot of them do is they want to come off their SSRIs. Here's what's happening. About 25% of those who've been on their SSRIs during puberty this is being named called PSSD. It's called post-sexual SSRI dysfunction. Post-SSRI sexual dysfunction is what it's called. The thought is this, and I don't want to alarm, but here's the thought. You go on an SSRI. The SSRI acts as a stressor, and it causes your brain to go into a subserotonergic state, all right? You end up with fewer serotonergic receptors. Now you come off the drug. The thought has always been is that the serotonergic receptors will renormalize, they'll repopulate. But there's actually no stressor causing that to happen. And what has happened is, in the presence of the drug, the brain has reset. And this is a whole sort of line of research known as epigenetics. So your gene expression has changed. The sort of homeostatic equilibrium of the cell has changed. And in the absence of a stressor, maybe the brain can't get back its normal serotonergic function. Now, there's been 8 rat studies on this, where they give SSRIs to rats when they hit puberty, which in rats is at day 45, I believe. They do it at relevant doses. Every study has found that as adult rats, they are, quote, impaired in their copulatory behaviors. And if you look at those rat studies, they say maybe the reason is because of this serotonergic problem. You're driving it into a subsensitive state. I know this is really upsetting for anyone to hear. Some of this research is being done at the University of Iowa. And the researcher who's talking about this, you know, think about the loss. Because the kids, and by the way, there's chatboards out there like crazy, kids talking about this. They're sharing stories and all. And some countries have now officially recognized it as a side effect. And by the way, it's not just kids. You'll see adults that have been on the drugs long term come off. They have the same thing too. It seems to be particularly problematic if it happens during puberty for whatever reason. The sexual dysfunction in some ways is remarkable. I interviewed many people who have this, and they said it's not just the sexual dysfunction. They'll say, I just can't get excited about life. I just really can't feel emotional towards somebody. One person says, I see a beautiful girl, I know I'm supposed to be attracted, I just can't feel it. If this is so, you can see why medicating children is such a profound thing. So if we modify the brain, cause changes, what are we doing to kids long term? And it's just such a profound thing to be doing. And the worry now is the brain resets in response to the drug, and in some, not always, but in some cases, it just can't reset. I feel really almost bad about saying this, but I think you can see that if you believe this is what science is saying, showing, well, you really have to think about putting kids on meds. You really have to think about it. So I hope to answer the question. Yeah. Next. So, how are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I just want to say, I've been seeing a lot of positive things. I've been living at Dignity Village for a year and a couple of months. I've seen people come in here not talking, not having social encounters, and I see that grow. Because all of a sudden they are not being judged for being homeless, they're not being diagnosed by anybody, and they're not being studied, or they're just being let be. And they're also invited to participate in community. So they come together to decide issues and govern themselves. And it's a really powerful experiment going on. So I've been seeing recovery happen, just being let alone and just being respected as another human being. And this is with all the internalized oppression that people who have been on the house for a long time have and carry. And carry from being poor and have that internalized oppression. Even with that, there's been a lot of recovery. And I really love the last part of your book about open dialogue. And I said, this is where we need to repair society, is by having conversations with each other. Like, right now I'm really aware, that I'm a white person living in Dignity Village, and that people of color are targeted by police, and they're not crazy, they're criminals. And they're locked away in exorbitant amounts of time. And it's like another associated connection thing. And the big, big problem is that we think that we are separated from each other. That is the underlying problem, is we think that we're not connected. We all come from the same dirt, and the same water, and the same air. Every one of us. And when any of us are suffering, you know, we have empathy neurons that respond to seeing that. So it's happened to us when we see somebody else suffering. And it's like, I am also a psychiatric survivor. And it's taken a long, long time to see how much people who are psychiatrists and people who have that trying to help someone else, and how much they're going to suffer, and I feel for that. Because I know they had to suffer going through psychiatry rounds to hurt people, know that they were hurting people, but couldn't say they were hurting people. Because that is a whole aspect of cult mind control. That's an aspect of cult mind control. To have people saying something, but you're seeing something else. It's really hard to separate yourself and actually say the truth for yourself and stand up for that truth in those situations. Gotten done.
Thanks. Thank you.
Sir, I just wanted to know if you believe in a fundamental slippery slope in the field of psychiatry toward use of the field in class warfare. And if so, how important would it be to recognize a holistic society change against such utilization?
In some ways, your question is not far off what he's talking about. If you heard that question, is are there class really? Or when we talk about diagnoses and we talk about who gets, quote, treated, who gets committed, is there a class element? Is there a racial element involved in this? And the answer is yes. And there's a lot of research related to this. I mean, first of all, when you were talking about the homeless, often people at a lower class are more likely to be diagnosed with whatever. There's famous racial studies on who gets diagnosed with schizophrenia. And the most famous one goes like this. They had this. They sent out a chart. The symptoms are the same on every chart. There's only one thing that's changed. Is it a black male, black female, white female? And then they asked psychiatrists to make a diagnosis. But remember, the symptoms are exactly the same. Now, which group do you think was most likely to be diagnosed schizophrenic?
Black male.
Black male. What's the next? What's that? Black female. What's the next?
White female.
Yeah, so it's white female. Least was white male. Now, why is that? Well, basically, the point was this. The further away people are from the person doing the diagnosis in class and gender, the more severe the diagnosis in essence. The more likely they're to be recognized as odd, doing something different, that sort of thing. So the point of this is a lot of these are social constructs, right? I mean, diagnoses. And it is where you have a sense that some people are not behaving correctly, right? Or they're not behaving to certain norms. And then you have to ask whose norms. And even let's just for a second go into whether it be class warfare. How about the old ADHD thing? What is ADHD? It's really a diagnosis that says this kid doesn't do well in the school environment, right? So one of the things we're saying is the kid isn't fitting the environment that we're creating for that kid. But we blame the kid. We're not saying that maybe that environment stinks, right? And let's say for whoever it might be, certain class, etc. So also, this is sort of a long-winded, not very good answer, but what I'm trying to say is psychiatric diagnoses do have a social element. They do have a class element in terms of who's diagnosed, that sort of thing. And I think we have to recognize that. And one of the things that's happening in prison, I used to work in prison a long time ago, in Attica prison. And Attica used to be, well, at the time I was there, they just had the riots. It was one of the roughest prisons in the country. But at that time, they were not diagnosing prisoners as mentally ill. They were criminals, okay? But the great thing about just being a criminal and not mentally mentally ill was you got probation and you were done. Now what we're doing is those people get in prisons, they get a mental label on them too. Okay? You always hear, get so many mentally ill in jail. Well, what we're doing is sort of doubly pathologizing them, right? So they have kids grow up, they're in a certain social environments, maybe they commit a crime, the next thing you know, now they're said to be bipolar and a criminal. And then they're medicated. Well, that's sort of like a double whammy. All I'm saying is, if we're going to reform this whole thing, we do have to be aware of class elements, racial elements, etc. They certainly play a role. And you see that in the foster care kids as well. Okay, thanks.
Would you have time to read over a table of advantages and disadvantages toward a holistic class change?
Sure, after the talk, sure.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi, I am a parent of a child has spent most of her young adult life in and out of hospitals, and currently is in a group home, and in order to stay in the group home, she's on SSI. She has to take the medication. And I began wondering, even before I was a believer in the current paradigm of there must be a chemical imbalance and some kind of cocktail. She's been through many different cocktails of medication. Somehow, something will help her advance out of this group home. But I noticed over the past year, I keep asking, why is there no progress? Why is she not advancing? Why does she not have encouraged to get a job, or there's no advancement. She just seems like she's not in a hospital, but she's being warehoused. All of her money is going to this organization. What can she do if she wants to break out? She's kind of stuck because in order to stay in that home, which is her shelter, she has to take the medication. If she doesn't want to take the medication, she's homeless.
Right. Y'all heard this question? Her daughter's in a group home. In order to stay in the group home, she has to take her medications. The option basically is homelessness, right? And her daughter's not progressing. Sort of just stabilizing. And you said your daughter's on a cocktail, correct? She's on more than one drug. This is why this question is important about what we believe. Because if we believe that we've made great progress, the drug should be the cornerstone of care. Next thing you know, we set up programs where the goal really is just to stabilize people so often, right? Because we don't really believe in sort of robust recovery. We insist on taking medications because it's the cornerstone of care. By the way, as you know, in many instances you will see people on cocktails, which just by their definition are sort of a sign things aren't going so well, right? If they were going so well, we wouldn't need cocktails, and we wouldn't need this whole thing. How old's your daughter, ma'am?
30.
30.
And she also has long-term health damage.
Right.
She did not have diabetes. She has diabetes. She did not have high, there's a lot.
Right.
Side effects.
Right. All I can say is, in some ways, this is the failure of the system we have right now. It really does not help people get robust lives back so often. And we need a system that at least does a better job of offering people that possibility. And offers the possibility for those who might want to go off meds at some point to give them support in doing so, and still not lose your shelter, and be supported in that. That's why I think this whole question is so important. Right now there's just this box, and there's no other possibility. We need to create other possibilities. So the answer though to your question, what can she do? I don't know.
I feel she's a guinea pig for the system.
This is happening to a lot of people. Now in SSI, group homes, cocktails, that is a really common thing happening now, and in poor health. And one last thing, and I don't mean to scare you, do you know what age people are dying that are having this paradigm of care on cocktails? Well, it was 25 years early, but that's people who
of women, particularly women with trauma histories and personality disorders, which is a whole other issue. I'm actually doing a lot of research on trauma-informed care, which basically asks, instead of asking what's wrong with you, asks what's happened to you, which I think is a really good potential model for working with people, particularly women and women who self-harm. So I was wondering if you had any insight into that or have seen, there's something called the sanctuary model.
What was the
the last part, I was just wondering if you've seen any models in practice. I know there's one called the sanctuary model. People at Salem Hospital actually did some really pioneering things around that. And so I just wanted to bring that up.
Sure. Well, two things real quickly. She's talking about the role of trauma in the developing of certain symptoms. Sexual trauma, I will tell you, if you look at women diagnosed with schizophrenia, you will often find sexual trauma in the past. It is real common. That's number one. Do you see some diagnostics that are gender-related? Absolutely. The old joke about borderline personality disorder was that was a diagnosis given by a male psychiatrist to a woman he didn't like. Yes. Used to be sort of a woman's diagnosis. I think they're changing that, but that sort of thing. I think this is part of the future, is to understand the role of trauma. A lot of research showing that trauma does correlate with later onset of psychotic symptoms. And what you said, I think, is really beautiful. Instead of asking what's wrong, let's ask what happened. And that's a wholly different thing as well. And that applies to everybody, kids, etc. So that's really a great way to put it. And by the way, one last thing on this gender thing. You also see a lot of, frankly, diagnosing related to, youth growing up, say, gay, lesbian youth, transgender youth. You see a lot of diagnosis related to that sort of identity thing, difficulties as well.
One thing, the Oregon legislature, it came up the last legislative session, not counting our most recent special session. There was a bill presented in the state legislature that would expand the right to prescribe medication beyond just the current legally nurse practitioners, general doctors, and board-certified psychiatrists can prescribe legally in Oregon. But the psychologists got together and decided that they needed to be able to prescribe medication. So my question, I don't know the outcome of that legislation, but it got me to thinking, if this is like a trend, I don't know if it is, I don't know if other states are going to broadly expand the rights of other treatment providers to prescribe medication. If it is a trend that picks up steam, my question to you is, would this likely expand the abuse of medication or over-medication, or would it possibly have the opposite effect where prescriptions could be given more judiciously because people who are not just trained in the medical model but from other educational backgrounds also have the power to prescribe?
You hear the question? The question is, others get prescribing powers beyond psychiatrists. Will this lead to more use of the drugs or more judicious use of the drugs? I don't know. But I think it actually might be the latter, but not for the reason necessarily you say. Right now what happens is you have an entire branch of medicine that has a guild interest in promoting medications. And I'm talking about psychiatry historically, because for the longest time they were the only ones with prescribing powers, and that's worth a lot. Now as that prescribing power becomes diluted, the guild interest in promoting that model of care may lessen. And they may actually have a new role as skeptics of the drugs, as the ones who know how to use them most judiciously and cautiously. So I think that might change the storytelling we hear around the drugs from psychiatrists. I actually think expanding the powers is good. I know that's an unconventional answer. This is the last question.
Yes. Thank you for who you are and your work. And what inspired you to review this research and write the book?
So, the question is, what inspired me to write this book? tempted to say masochism. No, really, I came at this totally through a back door. By the way, I started as a conventional believer with conventional wisdom. It really goes back to when I was doing a series for the Boston Globe, and really abuses of patients in psychiatric research centers. And I came upon the World Health Organization studies that said that thing about it, just living in a developed country is a strong predictor you won't do well. And I said, why is that? It just seems something wrong, a failure. And then when I looked at the study and found that the medication protocol was different, I was stunned. You know what that series also wrote about? How unethical it was to ever do studies where you took people off their antipsychotics. We said that's unethical because these drugs are like insulin for diabetes. You should never take, and you should never do a study where you're taking someone's schizophrenia for minutes. So it really was two things. Or, then I'm going to add one more. One, that the failure. Two, that suddenly it didn't make sense with what I knew to be true. Out of the essence of the importance of the drugs. And the third was this. I remember calling someone from Oregon, David Oakes, from Mind Freedom. And I'm calling up about the medication withdrawal studies. And I'm basically searching for a quote from David Oakes saying, yeah, that's horrible that they withdrew the drugs. They wouldn't do that to any other class of patients. Instead, David Oakes says, oh, there's good reason to do that. What? And David basically said, listen, maybe there's a whole nother story to be discovered out there. And it's the perspective of those who are treated may be very different than the perspective of those who are doing the treating. And I became very interested in that story. And that led to Mad America. And one of the things about Mad America is it incorporates the sort of the words and the vision and the perspective of those who are treated into the history. And when you do that, it's a very different history. So that's how I did Mad America. I really, as Marcia said once, after I did Mad America, my agent said, run as fast as you can from this topic. Don't get into it again. It's not good for your career. So I'm serious. And I wrote 2 other books, but then people kept saying, what about kids? What about bipolar? What about depression? And I just think it's such an important subject for our society. It is changing us. It is changing how we raise our children. It's changing about our sense of self, about what's the resilience. It is, I think, actually encouraging a sense of victimization or sort of powerless before our brain chemistry. So it is such an important thing in our society, so I really wanted to come back to it because is it working for us? And if not, what might we do better? And it just seemed like a profound topic. Thanks very much.
I just want to say that I am co-founder of a movement called the Moms Movement, and we're mothers who experience outrage, shock, and heartbreak about the treatment of our adult children in the mental health system. And we have found that together they cannot silence us or prevent us from having contact if we are together. And so if you're interested in being a part of that, you don't have to be involved, you can be an ally. All the emails that we can get for people to support us when our children are being abused in the system helps.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, as a teacher, I know the best teacher is a model. And from what I've understood and learned from Bob Whitaker for the last year and a half, is he is doing this because morally he can't do anything else. And I think that's the way it is probably with everyone here. I'm inviting you to come to the symposium. If you're trying to figure out what to do next, there'll be lots of other people and lots of ideas there. And I don't know if you didn't get one of these flyers, please make sure you get one and come to the symposium. And then I do want to give a wonderful round of applause and gratitude